Our first speaker will be Dr. Juliette Wells from Goucher College in Baltimore. Dr. Wells is a renowned scholar, lecturer, and author on Jane Austen, and she will be presenting Jane Austen in translation. Dr. Wells, it's all yours.
Hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right away, which makes my head very small. And let me see. I have something that I need to remove from my view. And now here we are. It's such a pleasure and honor to take part in this is evening for me, different days for different people. I remember speaking with Susanna Fullerton and members of the Jane Austen Society of Australia when I visited them back in 2013, and we had the idea, wouldn't it be wonderful to bring together Jane Austen loving readers from Australia and from North America? And we thought at the time, well, where could we all maybe get to that's kind of in the middle? And we thought of Hawaii. So Zoom brings us together from many more places, and it's such a thrill. I really appreciate the invitation, which came from Susie, and I especially appreciate the encouragement to present outside my comfort zone. I am not an expert in translations. I will say that at the beginning, in the middle, and the end. So my perspective is very much that of a literary scholar who works on collectors of Austen, who thinks about books and their readers and engagement in that sense. So I gladly defer to the expertise of others who are present and not present on the contents of Austen translations. I'm also not on the Pacific Rim, so I'm out of place in that sense too. Let me give us a quick table of contents so you can see where we're going to be headed. I know some of you know about Goucher College's Jane Austen collection, but many of you may not. So a quick introduction and overview of that. I'll speak about our founding collector, Alberta Burke, and her friend, the bibliographer David Gilson, and their work together on Austen translations. Then I'll zero in on the Pan-Pacific and where we can find interesting examples of Austen translations from those regions at Goucher. And then very briefly, I'll sketch out a few of my ideas and ideas that I'm working on with colleagues for further work in the translations at Goucher, and then questions. So some of you will know about Goucher College. I know we have at least one alum in the audience. Thank you, Emily Bergman. I'm coming from suburban Baltimore in Maryland on the East Coast of the United States, not too far from Washington, D.C. I'm in my office. It's night. It's very quiet here on a Saturday night on the office floor. For those of you located outside the US, let me say Goucher is a college in the American sense of that word, meaning an undergraduate liberal arts institution. Goucher was the first US institution to require all undergraduate students to study abroad, and global education remains a significant focus for us. And why I'm here, why we're here together, Goucher is the home of an unparalleled collection of Austen material. I will have more to say in a moment about Alberta H. Burke, our founding donor, and her particular interest in translations. But the screen that you've been looking at for a few moments here is our overview. Among the highlights of our collection are first English editions in different states, first American editions, first illustrated editions, and other rare editions of Austen's novels, translations, of course, as well as period publications on landscape and architecture, fashion, and more that helped our donors visualize Austen's world and help visitors and students do the same today. We have 20th century ephemera relating to Austen, many newspaper articles, theater playbills, and more. And we have the archives of JASNA, the Jane Austen Society of North America, and personal papers of many of the society's founding members, and more adding to that part of our collection all the time. And at the top of your screen, you see the address for our very new website at Goucher for the Jane Austen collection, janeausten.goucher.edu. I do hope that you'll visit the website. It is certainly a first effort. We hope to build and add to it over time, but we are proud of being able to share that tonight. And here you see the banner for the page that shows our kind of glamour shot of some of the spines of the translations in the Austen collection. And as you can see, our tagline for this image is translations of Austen's novels into dozens of languages enable the exploration of the author's global legacy. That dozens is a weasel word. I don't have an exact number for you either of the languages that into which Austen was translated in books that we own, or a total number of copies. I can say hundreds, but I can't give you an exact number. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to prepare this talk was that I wanted to take the opportunity to learn more about this underexplored aspect of the Jane Austen collection and to be able to share that knowledge with interested people. I also want to write a new webpage about the translations. Here's a photo of where the translations live in our closed stacks, humidity and temperature controlled. My library colleagues have shelved them all together, which is, I think, a very friendly way for them to live. Our catalog uses the Library of Congress system, in which the catalog number for each translated title puts it in the company of all other copies of that title. So this shelf pulls the copies that are translated from those other places and brings them all together. Some of the shelves that you see are double stacked at the moment, and we definitely want to get those books out so that they can breathe. I've also listed on this slide the generous donors who originally collected these translations. I often say that the Jane Austen collection at Goucher is a collection of collections, and that is very much the case for our translations. The dates that you see are not the dates of birth and death for our collectors, but the dates when each person actively collected. Both Alberta Burke and Barbara Wynne Adams began collecting in the 1930s, and in both cases, their materials reached us as bequests. Alberta Burke died in 1975 and Barbara Adams in 1997. J. David Gray, known as Jack Gray, who many of you will recognize as one of the 3 co-founders of JASNA, was in the next generation of collectors. I don't know exactly when he began collecting Austen, approximately 1960. He died in 1993, and his descendants donated a portion of his collection, including some translations, to Goucher just 2 years ago in 2019. And then early last year, in early 2020, we received a very significant donation of translations, recent translations, from longtime JASNA member Edith Lang, who began collecting in the 1980s. So as in terms of the years of collecting from the 1930s to 2010s. And then library staff have purchased additional materials, principally published in the last 25 years. Especially when preparing an exhibit in 2015 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the publication of Emma. And you can look in our library catalog to try to find translations. It's not a particularly satisfying way to search, and that is certainly a project for us to make a full list more available. What you can do from our homepage, janeausten.goucher.edu, is choose Explore, click on Emma in America, and then we have what my colleagues call an Emma cover gallery. And this is an interactive site that shows you the sometimes quite astonishing cover illustrations of different copies of Emma. You can sort this catalog by date, language, country, or publisher. I've sorted it by language for this screenshot, so beginning with Arabic. And then if you're curious about a particular copy, you can click on the cover image and you get the date of publication and the entire catalog record. So this is one way for us to share some of the translations that are in our collection. So Alberta Burke, David Gilson, and translations. I'm coming back to our list of donors in order to explain why Goucher has the translations that we do and why we don't have the ones that we don't. David Gilson's monumental bibliography of Jane Austen was the first reference work to catalog translations of Austen. And his book was first published in 1982 with a revised edition in 1997. Alberta Burke, who died in 1975, did all her collecting before Gilson published his bibliography. So she did not have access to the lists of translations that he compiled. The other 3 collectors, Barbara Wynne Adams, Jack Gray, and Edith Lang, all had access to Gilson's bibliography. Alberta Burke's translations were, in fact, sources for David Gilson. She and he corresponded for many years while he was preparing his translation, and he visited Alberta Burke in person at her apartment just a few months before her death and saw her translations in person. So many of the ones that he listed in his catalog were copies that she owned. Let me fill in just a little bit about her. She was born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is in the American Midwest. She came east to college and graduated from Goucher in 1928. Goucher was at that time an all-women's institution. She returned to her home state, Wisconsin, to pursue graduate study in literature and earned her master's. And then, like many Goucher women at the time, she married the brother of a classmate, Henry G. Burke, known as Harry of Baltimore. And she essentially spent her entire adult life developing her expertise on Jane Austen, a real passion project of hers to become a collector. She was not a publishing scholar. She was not affiliated with the university, but she was certainly on the level with scholars in terms of her knowledge. This is a picture of her and her husband together on one of their many transatlantic trips. He was an estate lawyer by profession. He also held a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University. And he too was one of the 3 co-founders of JASNA 4 years after his wife's death in 1979. JASNA, as many of you will know, currently has almost 6,000 members throughout the USA and Canada, including some international members as well. Henry Burke wrote an article for JASNA's journal Persuasions in 1985 about the origins of the translations in his collection, well, in the collection that he and his wife built together, She Chiefly. He mentioned that they began collecting translations in 1939 when they were visiting Quebec. And we know from other documents in the Austen collection that they made that journey because they were not able to visit Europe during the First World War. So French translations were their first acquisitions. Throughout their collecting, they collected translations primarily in person. Wherever they've traveled, they went to bookshops and they looked for the translations of Austen that were in print at the time. It must be said that the Burkes were very oriented towards Europe as travelers, at least until Alberta's death. Harry mourned her very deeply, as we know from letters in our collection, but he also took advantage of the opportunity to visit places that she had not wanted to go, and those included Israel and Egypt. If you are curious to know more about Alberta Burke's collecting, I offer an overview of it and a portrait of her in my book, Everybody's Jane, Austen in the Popular Imagination. I tell the story of her surprise donation of a lock of Jane Austen's hair to the Jane Austen Society UK in 1949, which is a great story and has nothing to do with translations. So I shall not tell it in full today. And in my most recent book, Reading Austen in America, the final chapter of that book draws on the correspondence between Alberta Burke and David Gilson, these 2 experts sharing their knowledge and becoming friends through correspondence, in spite of considerable differences in age and other differences in identity. I'm going to read just a little bit from Reading Austen in America to give a sense of what translations meant to Alberta Burke as a collector, what they meant to Gilson, and why it's so important that the 2 of them knew each other and that Alberta supported David Gilson's work on his bibliography. And the one fact that I need to clarify before these excerpts is that David Gilson's day job for his entire career was as a modern languages librarian at one of the libraries at the University of Oxford. The library that he worked for was called the Taylor Institution Library, and he calls it in one of his letters, the Taylorian. So Bodley Library, the Bodleian, Taylor Library, the Taylorian. You will hear that. In contrast to Alberta Burke's wide-ranging reach for her Jane Austen archives, David Gilson concentrated as a collector on acquiring items that, in his view, deserved to be included in a bibliography, that is, a reference work on Austen publishing history. In several respects, David Gilson drew more capacious boundaries than had his predecessors in Austen bibliography, Geoffrey Keynes and R.W. Chapman. The table of contents for Gilson's typewritten catalog of his personal collection, which he shared with Alberta Burke in 1968, included a category for translations. Alberta Burke's greatest influence on Gilson's bibliography resulted from her encouragement of his interest in translations. For her, editions in languages unfamiliar to her fell into the category of archives, of importance but not of personal utility. She wrote to him, Of course, I cannot read all the languages in which I have JA translations. I can stab at a few, but the Finnish, modern Greek, Hebrew, and Japanese and Chinese, most of which were gifts from kind friends, are possessions, not useful tools. And what you see here are snapshots with some glare on them of the Finnish, the Greek, and the modern Hebrew in Alberta Burke's collection. Following Alberta Burke's offer to send David Gilson duplicate copies of translated novels in her possession, he commented, "I've never really gone into the question of translations. Those I have were largely chance acquisitions, but I feel I would like to have at least one in each of as many languages as possible, together with as many French ones as come my way." He was a French specialist. "Your kind offer will go a long way towards the achievement of this aim. I intend one day to go through the UNESCO list of translations, a job I once started in the Bodleian." David Gilson described himself as amazed at Alberta Burke's possession of 70 translations. He declared, "I hope to have a representative selection in time, but am unlikely to approach this figure." He did his best, however, and he happily apprised his appreciative audience of his progress, writing, "I have one minor triumph to report. I now own a copy of the Russian translation of Pride and Prejudice. The Taylorian's Slavonic expert found this copy for me during a recent trip to Russia. The binding is a little damaged, so it may have been withdrawn from sale, but it is perfect internally. You may imagine how I shall value this rarity." And these two experts exchanging letters, their enormous enthusiasm for their work comes across. They allow themselves to show that to each other with their exclamation points. Alberta Burke loved nothing more than to trade stories about discovering and tracking down rare or surprising translations. "Did you know that the Danes are the only ones of whom I know who have ever translated Lady Susan?" she wrote. "They must really like JA. I remember in 1953 walking almost all over Copenhagen to try to find a copy, ending up at the publisher's office where a kindly, handsome, tall, blonde Danish gentleman took us to the firm's warehouse, where he gave me their last copy. They had nothing left but an imperfect one, which was indeed a grand gesture. So I've always treasured my copy with a special regard." Both David Gilson and Alberta Burke were more aware than anyone else in the world of how dismissively earlier Austen bibliographers had treated translations. As she remarked, though Sir Geoffrey Keynes tried in 1929 to be inclusive, Dr. Chapman in 1952 clearly stated that he was only listing the things that were of interest to him. Translations were not. Articles in magazines only if they tied in with his own work or were in themselves outstanding. So David Gilson, in his eventual bibliography, differentiated between 19th century translations and what he termed modern translations. And he provides detailed, intricate, lengthy descriptions of all of the 19th century translations, which were into French, German, Swedish, and Danish. He notes that the copies that he studied, each was in its respective national library. So these were not copies that he had found anywhere else. He found them in the National Library of the country. In terms of modern translations, 20th century translations, he listed them alphabetically as follows, as you see, Arabic to Turkish, and certainly there are many more now. The earliest translation in the Goucher collection is a 1921 Madrid publication of Northanger Abbey. So we do not have any of the 19th century translations or any very early 20th century translations. And this copy was collected by Barbara Wynne Adams, the second of the four collectors I mentioned a moment ago. There has been abundant work on Austen translations into European languages. The Reception of Jane Austen in Europe in the middle, edited by Anthony Mandel and Brian Southam, is a foundational text. And there are starting to be book-length studies of Austen translations into individual European languages, including Norwegian and Bulgarian, as you see. And Persuasions and Persuasions Online are a rich source of recent work on Austen in Japan and beyond. I want to especially acknowledge Gillian Dow's two treatments of translations for the Cambridge Companion to Pride and Prejudice and the Cambridge Companion to Emma. And these are significant both because of their thoroughness. Gillian takes each title from its earliest translation through the present day, all across the world, but also because Jillian did some of her research in Goucher's Jane Austen collection. And that lovely picture of her from about 10 years ago is in our special collections reading room. She has translations on the desk in front of her. So where do we find the Pan-Pacific among Austen translations at Goucher? I pulled out all of the translations that we have into Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, and I took this group photo of them for us all together on one shelf. And now I'm going to single out and show us 3 representative volumes that were originally owned by Alberta Burke. And these are of interest because of their physical material qualities, as well as because of their contents. And if you are looking at this picture on a screen that's big enough that you can see the books individually, I'm going to start with the 2 books furthest from the left. So these are both slip-covered volumes. One is white on the top, turquoise in the bottom, and the next is kind of shades of brown and tan. Here is the front of the slip-covered volume. This is a Japanese translation from 1968. We're going to start on the outside and work our way in. This slipcover states that this volume contains Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion by Jane Austen, and that it is volume 29 in a series of color illustrated translations of world classics published by the Tokyo publisher Kawade Shobo Shinsha. The other side of the slipcover adds the translator's name. And if you see the illustration of Austen's face, right above her head are the 2 titles, translating to Pride and Persuasion. And right above that, in much smaller white print, Austen and the translator's name, Tomojo Abe, who is remembered as a translator and also a modern novelist in his own right. And from other sources, it can be ascertained that his translation of Persuasion was new in this year, 1968. His translation of Pride and Prejudice was originally published in 1963. So inside the slipcover, you pull out the volume, and it is a very handsomely bound volume, as you see, with gold on black and a nice red label on the spine. What's neat about this copy is that whoever gave it to Alberta Burke included the promotional material that was included by the publisher when the book was originally purchased. So you open up the book and there are 6 or 7 different postcard sized items, including this one, which shows evidently the entire set of world literature that you could purchase, of which this is 1 volume. And it seems you could purchase a custom-made bookshelf as well that would hold all these volumes. And I don't know if you could buy the clock or not. This is just 1968 modern gorgeousness. Inside our copy of Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion is a page listing all the titles in this series. I'm always interested in what company Austen finds herself in when she is in a series. She's in very good company here. Volume 1 contains the Iliad and the Odyssey. The volume of Shakespeare has King Lear and Hamlet. Of course, there is a Bronte volume, and there are major works by Russian, French, American, Chinese, and German authors. Another promotional postcard inside our cover tells us that the publisher commissioned illustrations from a Philip Goff, who seems to have been, shall we say, inspired by such turn of the 20th century illustrators as the Brocks. And brace yourselves, the next slide is a little distressing, at least I find it so. This appears to be Philip Goff's lurid rendering of the Cassandra portrait. I'm kind of unofficially a collector of horrible portraits of Jane Austen of the past, and I think this might win one of the prizes. What I would love to know more about in this book is the multi-page introduction to Jane Austen's life and times, which is richly illustrated, as you can see here, with color photographs of what places look like in 1968, as well as some historic images. And this would be a great student project, I think, an independent project for a Goucher student who has sufficient facility with Japanese to translate this introduction and seek sources relating to it. My second example is this slip-covered Korean translation. This is also a 2-in-1 book, though in this case, 2 different authors are represented rather than 2 works by Austen. And Alberta Burke did know, somebody gave her the information as to which works were included and the translator's name. This is a little handwritten card and pencil by Alberta that she tucked into the book, showing us this is Pride and Prejudice and Silas Marner, published in 1965. And in this book, there's a title page inside and these two rather distressingly horrible portraits of Jane Austen and George Eliot. The reproduction quality is just dreadful. It's not my bad photograph. It really looks this bad in person. And finally, my third example is a different kind of international publication of Austen. This is not, strictly speaking, a translation, but it is an edition for students of English. It was published by Ken Kiyusha in the English Classics series. As you can see from the page numbers in this table of contents, the introduction is very extensive. It's 50 or 60 pages long, and the notes section is about 120 pages. The notes address translation questions. They support students who are reading the English and thinking of it in translation, and also the notes provide contextual information. The first page of the introduction here gives you a sense of how English language place names and people's names are integrated into the Japanese. What is very special about this particular copy is that it shows the signs of having been read and used. Its original owner, whose name is not given in this book, as far as I know, worked through every page, glossing and annotating in pencil with the support of those notes at the back. Tucked in the front cover of this copy is this tantalizing envelope with Alberta Burke's note, information about this book, but this envelope is empty. It is possible that the information is elsewhere in Alberta Burke's files. I will look. I don't even know whether this envelope that she wrote the note on is related to the gift of the book or not. If it is, possibly the people who are named in the return address, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Weiss of Chapel Hill, perhaps they were the ones who conveyed this book to Alberta. I hope I've given you a taste for how exciting and how underexplored the translation collection at Goucher is, and I really look forward to your questions in just a moment. I will keep this brief, but I wanted to take the opportunity to share some ideas in progress at Goucher. My colleagues in writing studies have recently created a new course on translation in which students do independent projects. And just this week, I met with the instructor of the course, and we agreed that I would come make a presentation on the Austen translations and that I would help with my library colleagues to set up individual projects for any students who have facility with the languages represented and who are interested. I'm also about to meet with colleagues in modern languages to brainstorm with them about possible course projects for their students. Our largest language faculty is in Spanish, which is a great fit with the abundance of Spanish translations, but we are just restarting a program in Chinese, which is exciting too. Special Collections and Archives in the Goucher Library administers generous fellowships donated by former professors at Goucher, Brooke and Carol Pierce, so that if a student did a course project on an Austen translation and wanted to come back and deepen and extend that work, they could use these dedicated fellowships for undergraduate research in the collection. We also have some modest funding specific to work in the Austen collection. I am in talks to reinvent and revive a program that Goucher College Library set up several years ago to enable students who are fulfilling their study abroad requirement to purchase books for the library while they were abroad. I've spoken with Goucher's Director of Global Education about encouraging students to look for Austen translations in particular when they are able to travel abroad again, which will be starting soon in spring 2022. The Goucher Library is putting the finishing touches on a joint fellowship with the American Society for 18th Century Studies, ASEX, to enable research in the Jane Austen collection here, and we would especially welcome applications focusing on translations. If any of these initiatives appeal to you or you are curious about our work, we invite you to visit our website, and we would be so glad of your support. We do, I will now shamelessly say, have a support button on the website, and you are able to give to us right through there, or you're welcome to contact me directly. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you better. And I welcome questions. I will take my own look at the chat, but if
We have
Susie, yeah,
we do have a
How do-
few. So one is from Joy Prevost in Sacramento. Is there anywhere on the Goucher website that has Jane Austen's name in various, what it looks like in different languages and characters?
no, what a great idea. I'll make a note of that. I appreciate all suggestions for what we should add to our website. I think that's a super idea. Okay, thank
In
you.
addition, titles to the works as well as her name. And
Perfect.
another question, this is from Jeannie Talbot. Has anyone rated the quality of the various translations, to your knowledge?
The studies that I'm aware of are individual to a language. So you would need a real comparativist to come in and be able to say, well, this German one compares to this French one. I have not read every word of every page of David Gilson's descriptions of the 19th century translation, so he might have some comparison of those in there. But certainly from the very early days, some of the 19th century translations were remarkably free and inventive. The French translation, first French translation of Sense and Sensibility is the best example of that. The French translator was dissatisfied with Austen's ending, and so rewrote it so that Marianne and Willoughby get together. So that's a translation, perhaps also kind of an adaptation.
Okay. Here's another question. This is from Catherine. Do modern translators try to capture the flavor of Regency writing? Do they mimic the style in their languages?
Many, but not all. And here I would really welcome much more research on these translations. The more we know about how the translations came about, the better. If we can find out how the translator was chosen, what knowledge the translator had, whether this was purely a commercial project, capitalizing on a recent film. That's what many of the translations, not surprisingly, from the last 20 years seem to be. I would just generalize and say the translators bring a huge range of knowledge about Austen's life and times, probably from not a whole lot to more. Certainly the cover illustrators, many of them seem to have a really loose conception of the fashion hairstyle of Austen's day, entertainingly so sometimes.
Another question, what is the cartoon illustration on your donation page?
Ooh, so the images that you see as you cycle through the pages of the website are all drawn from our collection. And let me look at that one again and be sure that I am speaking accurately. That is from Dr. Syntax, one of the beautiful illustrated volumes that our original collector, Alberta Burke, purchased. She was interested in the hand-colored illustrations of the day, including some caricatures and satiric works.
Do you have a Spanish translation of the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice?
With me right now today, no. I beg your pardon. I'm not sitting in our library. I'm in my own office. But we have many translations into Spanish elsewhere on the campus where I am not.
Is there an English retranslation of the French Sense and Sensibility that has Willoughby and Marianne getting together?
Oh, I think you have a project. No, to my knowledge, there is not. But what an interesting, at least to translate those few chapters back, what an interesting project that would be.
It really would.
Yeah.
Any translations in Hawaiian yet?
I don't know. Does anyone else know? I defer to the expertise of others present, not in the Goucher collection.
To my knowledge, there is not. I posed that question at the Department of Hawaiian Studies at University of Hawaii, and no one knew of any, so there may not be.
Wow. Thank you.
Here's a question. Do you have the Indonesian translations from Kanita Imprint, Maison Publishers, and Bandung? I'm going to probably butcher all those words. They have all the books in translations, some up to their 3rd edition.
I would have to check and get back to you. And this is a perfect example of why my Goucher colleague college library colleagues and I need to prepare a complete list. And I would just say quickly, I mentioned the very recent donation of 100 or more translations from Edith Lank. Most of those are not in our library catalog yet because there are not English language catalog records that our librarians can easily pull. So this is an ongoing project too for a small college to outsource that work in a way that can include every title that we have in the collection. But I would have to get back to you about whether we have Indonesian.
I think you sort of answered this earlier. Do translators attempt to use Austen's, free and direct speech? I think, as you said, it kind of varies depending on the translator.
It really does. I mean, some translations I would say show their age in the sense that you can, if you are conversant with the language and its literature, you would be able to tell which decade it was translated in, pretty much. Others not. So great variety there.
Here's something from Janine Barkas, thanking you for this great overview. There may be many fans with odd copies of translations. Is there a process or call to action about crowdsourcing more examples?
What a great question. Thank you, Janine. There is information on the new website about contacting us if you have materials that you're interested in donating. The Goucher College Jane Austen collection is not comprehensive and can never be comprehensive. So we will always be a starting place for research. It would be very interesting, I think, Janine, if you and your digital colleagues, or if a consortium came around that wanted to build on the Goucher Jane Austen collection and aim towards more comprehensiveness than we can represent.
Here's another question. And speaking of Janine, if you haven't read her wonderful latest book, it has some wonderful covers of a few Austen translations, which is really fun. Here's another question. Has anyone gotten in touch with the return addressees on the envelope that said information enclosed?
No, I searched them. They were both professors at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. They both died within the last 15 years after good long lives. And the connection seems to be that Charles Weiss, the husband of the couple, did his doctorate at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And so perhaps he and the Burkes met each other during those years. I don't know. I could contact their children. I was imagining the email that I would write. Hello, do you know if your parents visited Japan or if any Japanese exchange students visited them? I mean, you never know. That would be the way to start, I think, is to say, I have a question that relates to a book.
I think we've got most of the questions here. There's one talking about, are there any differences in Jane Austen's novels becoming popular between Britain, modern world, and the time, like the most popular novel in the translations? I think is what it's asking. Oh,
what an interesting question. Jane Austen's popularity has had different trajectories in different countries around the world. And you could start from David Gilson's bibliography and make a chart in terms of how many translations and how close to each other chronologically. This isn't a question that, unfortunately, that I can answer off the top of my head.
This is a great question. Do you include American, New Zealand, Australian translations and the differences between them? Is that part of the collection?
Well, we have editions of Austen from international publishers, including European publishers. I was all excited when I saw in our catalog that there's an 1860s Tauchnitz publication, but it turns out it's in English. It's published by Tauchnitz in Germany, but it's an English language publication. And so if an edition of Austen containing all the words of the original is published here, there, and elsewhere, then that is of interest in terms of what's available in the different countries, what readers have access to. It seems like that offers us a different kind of window onto Austen reception than, when was Austen first translated into Japanese, when into Chinese? Related questions, certainly.
And one more question, and then we'll take our break. Will your website eventually have links where we can purchase translations of Austen works? I would love to start my own collection, and I'm curious about how to get my hands on some without having to travel to these places.
Oh, I don't think we will be able to become a bookstore in that sense, but yeah. Well, let me talk to my colleagues. Let me see what's possible. I think we're on the other end. We are more likely to welcome inquiries from people who have been collecting translations and who want to know, would these be duplicates for you? I'd like to make a donation to Goucher. I think that's more the end that we're likely to be on. But I would say all of the 4 collectors I mentioned, they all collected before the internet. They all did it the old-fashioned way. Wherever they went, they bought books. Their friends knew they were Austen collectors and gave them books. They looked in catalogs. They made book dealers aware. We have such an easier time now that we can search and find, and we can use online translators to help us understand what covers are saying and all of that. But go forth, collect translations. It's a much more affordable kind of collecting than collecting first editions, that's for sure.
Definitely. And someone mentioned that a Vancouver member has translated several of Austen's novels into Japanese. So it can be very interesting. And some translations, someone else just noted that there are some translations available on Gutenberg.org. So
Super.
that's something to check out, everyone. So we will make the chat available too, so that, Juliet, we can send you some of these comments and questions. And you can also, if there are any updates, we'll include them in our newsletter. So thank you so much, Juliet. This is perfect. And we have a lot of great comments about how wonderful the presentation was. So thank you.
Thank you all. What a pleasure. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, we're going to take a quick little break, 5 minutes, and then we'll be back with our next speaker. Thanks, everyone.